Every thought that you have alters your mind. This may not sound like an amazing concept, but it's absolutely astonishing and scary if you think about it long enough. Every time you waste an hour watching trash, every time you choose cat videos over a book, you're altering your ability to think. What do I mean, every thought alters your mind? I mean that your mind physiologically changes every thought you have. Who remembers this? Yep, it's a screensaver from Windows 95. Why did we have these? We had these because every image you put on your computer changed your screen a tiny little bit. Over time, your screen would actually wear that pattern into the physical hardware. Your screen would essentially lose the ability to project new images. Let's look at how your brain does the same. This is an artificial neural net. Artificial neural nets are computer programs modeled on how brains are believed to handle thought. Neural nets are incredibly powerful because tiny, very simplistic decisions can lead to powerful and complex outcomes. Neural nets are used where data is fuzzy. Most computer programs see A as A, 1 is 1, etc. This means that numbers and letters are exact and precise. Our brains and artificial neural nets work differently. Our world isn't precise. When we see our friends tomorrow, they won't be the same person they are today. Their faces will be different. Their hair may be a different color, their eyes may be droopy, or they may be wearing a hat, yet we can easily recognize them. For a computer to recognize them, it uses an artificial neural net. To understand how our brains do this, we need to look at how neural nets work. Data is fed into a neural net as simple on and off values. For a simple example, let's look at how a program recognizes a hand-printed letter on a piece of paper. All of these we instantly recognize as A, even though from a computer's perspective, they're all different. First, the computer cuts the paper into squares. Each square can be either on or off. We then lay each square one next to another. We now have a bunch of ones and zeros that we feed into our neural net. In a neural net, cells are organized in layers. Each layer's cell is connected to each other cell in the next layer. Each cell can be either on or off, 1 or 0. But each cell's connection to the next has a random number assigned to it. This is called its weight. If we look at a sample individual cell, this one has 3 connections coming into it. One connection has a weight of decimal 4, and one has a weight of decimal 2.5, and one has a weight of decimal 1.6. The cell will fire 1, or on, whenever its value is higher than 0.5. This means that any 2 connections will cause it to fire, since adding any of these 2 weights together is more than 1/2, or 0.5. This happens in every single cell. The inputs from our sketch trigger some cells, but which other cells get triggered depends on the weights that the connections have. What's the odds that our network will trigger the A output node as true? Very, very small. Here's where the magic happens. We train the network. We try it, and it gives us the wrong output. So we adjust the weight. Just enough to get it to give us the correct answer. But watch what happens now. If we feed a B into it, it will probably say, sure, I've been trained to give you an A, so here's an A. But no, of course that's wrong. So we train it again. We train it to answer B this time. And we continue like this. We show it hundreds of different letters, all written different ways, and eventually the network learns to recognize our letters. This is the way your Mac and Facebook recognize your face in your pictures. This is how Siri and other programs can understand your voice. And eventually, this is how cars will drive themselves. Okay, here's where things get neat. It turns out that training must be done correctly. If, for example, we were to simply train the letters in a particular order, the network might learn just to repeat the order. Or, if we left out a letter for the first half of the training, it might become very difficult or even impossible to properly train the network to process it later. It's possible to overtrain a network. In this case, it might simply start to remember the exact letters as I've written them, instead of being general enough to adapt to a new person's printing style. Your brain works using similar concepts. It's always adjusting the weight of each connection based upon your previous thought. People who live in fear Their mind has been reprogrammed to expect fear. Scarcity produces thoughts of scarcity. If you win a few rolls of the dice, your brain adjusts itself to believe that wins are more likely than they actually are. Of course, the brain is more complex than this, but this only adds to the problem. Your brain also uses complex signaling methods to reward or punish you. This can make proper training even more difficult. Perhaps you've heard of the 10,000 hour rule. This was made famous in Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers. He suggests that actual skill is very rare. It's extremely difficult to find innate ability. Almost all ability is the result of very careful training. And training takes two things: repetition and feedback. Repetition helps build those neural pathways. It literally wears a path in our brain by strengthening connections around our area of study. This is the 10,000 hour part. But the feedback part is also very important. Some activities provide instant feedback. In those activities, you can train your network easily, since you can identify failures and correct them. Other activities provide less direct feedback, and in those areas, it's harder to improve. There are other difficulties with training that are best explored with a graph. Let's look back at our printed letter recognition example. Remember when we started training our network? We start with a random initial brain. Each training reconfigures the brain to give us a correct answer. Each further training tweaks the brain closer and closer to its goal of minimum errors. If this graph represents overall possibilities, when we train, we will randomly hit different points. As we train further, we will slowly push our neural net towards a peak. This means that we get closer and closer to our goal of minimum errors. But as you can see, the problem is we may hit the wrong peak. We may train our model more and more towards a good solution, but not the best solution. In fact, in order to get our network to reach the actual perfection it needs, this is hard to do mathematically, and an easier way is to randomly start again. Remember, each network starts from a different random point, so even by training it using the same data, we could get a different brain. More importantly, we can design the training so that in our initial learning, we don't overtrain it too much in one direction. If we were to feed our network too many A's in the beginning of our training, we might get more incorrect guesses of A later. The more varied the initial training, the better chances the network will actually hit the maximum and not a local maximum. Consider this in terms of society and our brain. Proper training is critically important. Training too much in one direction, indoctrination, can make it very hard to learn new ideas, since your brain essentially needs to get worse or unlearn before it can learn correctly. The human mind evolved to handle information from small numbers of people that we trust, our tribe or our clan. Things like social media have worn patterns or facts into our brain that we actually have to unlearn before we can understand the real world. Our time spent reading memes might make our brains less able to understand complex theories like this one. Some of the famous tech designers from Apple, Microsoft, and others limit or even remove all screen time from their kids. They do this because they realize how hard it is to correct an improperly trained brain. Brains evolved requiring much more stimulus than any computer screen can provide. With this in mind, let's consider every thought we have. Are we spending our time thinking about things that actually get us closer to our goals? Does seeing another Jackass video help or hinder our ability to understand the world around us? Does reading social media's memes help our brain understand government, or does it build false pathways that actually limit our ability to properly analyze the world?